Hey everyone. Had a few people ask me about my thoughts on the banned restricted list. Probably easier to do this all in one video, and then if you have any further questions, put them in the comments and I will get to those. Probably a bit easier than answering everybody, as this is a subject that people are really interested in. We've got Vintage, Luris the Dream Den, unbanned, as well he should be. I mean, he did not do the crime, he should not be doing the time. This is not a card, as is now working, that has proven to be a problem. We simply haven't used this card in Vintage when it costs 3 additional mana. So yeah, let's get that back. Let's see if it actually works. If it's a problem, go ahead and ban it again. But as it is, I mean, if Ancestral Recall costs 4 mana, it would not be on the banned list. So the fact that this costs an extra 3 at least merits putting it out there for people to play with, and let's see how good it ends up being. Legacy, we've got Arkham's Astrolabe, Dreadhorde Arcanist, and Oko Thief of Crowns, all getting the axe, all incredibly good Magic cards. And, you know, Legacy is a place where you're supposed to be able to play incredibly good Magic cards, all but the absolutely very, very best cards. And, you know, Oko may qualify. I'm not going to lie. Like, if we're being objective, he is one of the most ridiculous cards ever printed. Now, it seems odd to me that he does get the axe, given that he's a 3-mana spell in a format that you can potentially win on the first turn. But he has seen a ton of play, and I think my main feeling about Legacy at this stage is it's so good. There are so many cards, there are so many interactions, and there are constantly new cards being printed that you can't really wreck Legacy by banning cards, unless you ban something that's super crucial to the format. I'm talking about things like Force of Will or Brainstorm, things that you can't play in other formats. Then yes, I think that would be a disaster, but you know, banning him is kind of like if they had never printed Oko. Legacy was fine before Oko was printed. It'll be fine now that he is banned. Dreadhorde Arcanist, Attack Caster Mage. You know what? It ended up being better than a lot of people thought. People were not super high on this card when it was printed. It took a while. And by the end, you know, the people that were originally wowed by this card ended up being correct. I mean, the advantage from this card is overwhelming over the course of a game, and talked about this a little bit with some people. I do agree that the fact that he is always so often useful in different matchups, you know, even something like Goblins was pointed out to me, you know, he's going to be able to be in the way of a Goblin Lackey, which is just gross. Like, there's so many matchups where he's actually just rock solid compared to a card like Sylvan Library. So if you're playing a combo deck, Dreadhorde Arcanist and Sylvan Library, very, very similar. They're both going to bury you. They're going to draw way more cards than you. It's going to be a disaster. You're just getting blown out. Whereas Sylvan Library versus Goblins, not so hot. So Dreadhorde was kind of good all the time in all of the matchups and made the best of your singleton, similar to Snapcaster Mage. So if you did have kind of a really good singleton in your deck, there were often times where you could leverage that multiple times in a particular matchup, and it would just be totally devastating. So something like a Swords to Plowshares, killing your opponent's creatures, you know, when you have it and it's just a blowout, and then you have another one, I mean, that can really swing the game super far in your favor. And then Arkham's Astrolabe, you know, that card allowed people to play with less dual lands, potentially being less concerned about Blood Moon and Wasteland. So I thought it was kind of a good thing for the format, but people, by and large, there was a lot of people that didn't like it, and I guess I'll talk about the impact of all of these. So I think Oko going probably puts more spotlight on cards like Brazen Borrower. Now that Delver Strategies have had an experience of not losing to Chalice of the Void, or not just getting blown out by a problem permanent that resolves. Historically, Delver Strategies needed to like counterspell Force of Will to stop these really difficult to deal with cards. Once Oko showed up, it wasn't really that big a deal. He could just show up and elk that thing, and you were right back in the game. So the problem of getting blown out has been answered by Oko previously. Will Delver Strategies just roll back into a mode where they're fine losing to Chalice? Probably not right away. Is it possible that that ends up being the best build of a Delver deck? Is one that's not going to have as much versatility, but is instead just going to be honed to a razor sharp edge at doing what it does best? Time will tell. But I would expect Brazen Borrower to be something that people play around with in the immediate future. as they don't want to walk away from the ability to answer problem permanents. Astrolabe, probably the biggest thing there is your basic lands are back. People have been complaining about snow basics being the only thing that you can realistically play at this point. You know, you can dust off your basics. It's not like Astrolabe's everywhere and you're really losing out by not playing snow basics. For those that aren't familiar, the premise is if you're running snow basics and you're playing like a Delver strategy, even though you don't run Astrolabe, when you throw out your first turn Ponder, for example, you don't necessarily tip your hand, letting people know that you're not on this Snowco strategy. So maybe some people will continue to run snow basics to try and make an illusion, to try and let people think that they're on Snowco, but I mean, probably not as relevant when the card's not omnipresent. Also, of course, if you're not able to play Astrolabe, you know, you could totally just bust out your basic lands again. You're not having your arm twisted anymore, that's for sure. And then Dreadhorde Arcanus, that's difficult to actually say what the impact is going to be. That guy just did so much in so many different matchups. You know, the card drawing engine was incredibly strong. I think it takes a lot of gas out of the blue-red Delver archetype, which I haven't seen as much of lately. Rug kind of settled in to be the most popular. And yeah, it's going to be interesting. I'm not really that interested in predicting the future because I don't generally take action based off of it. So, you know, I see Oko leaving, and one of my first thoughts is like, well, if Oko's leaving, then maybe Tropical Island starts to cool off. Maybe green starts to go down in value because everybody was playing green largely for Oko. So, you know, what do you do with that? Like, I'm still going to have, you know, 20 or 30 Tundras and 20 or 30 Tropical Islands. If those switch place in the rank order in terms of price, it doesn't really change stuff for me. I still need to have the cards for my players, so there's not a lot that I can do with that. But I'd imagine there are some people who are interested in speculating that might take a look and see how that's going to work. I would just caution them to also say that Magic is a really big, complex system, and it's pretty normal for people to get a view based off of the formats they're most familiar with, whether it's Legacy or Commander or a mixture of various formats. But ultimately, Kitchen Table's a big part of it as well, so it's just difficult to take and gauge, unless it's something like Euro getting the ban across like tons of formats. I mean, you can predict the price will drop there, especially with the Secret Lair coming out, but I mean, that's pretty much my take, is those cards are going to come out of Legacy. Legacy's still going to be awesome. People are going to make adjustments to try and play decks that they've been playing. And ultimately, this is probably a big enough of a shakeup that we will see room for some new decks. I mean, I've got some stuff that I'd be interested in trying out in Legacy. And those cards going really just make it better. Cards like Hull Breacher, really anything that's looking to have a permanent as part of his game plan gets better with Oko out of the format, so that does open up some possibilities. When you're jumping through hoops to try and make stuff happen, you really don't want it to get unraveled by a single card like Oko. Modern loses Field of the Dead, Mystic Sanctuary, Simian Spirit Guide, Tybalt's Trickery, and Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath. Yeah, I mean, I think with Modern, if your deck isn't getting banned, you're probably doing it wrong. Like, that's pretty much how they manage that format, just a continual wave of bans. They figure out like which decks are good, and then they say you can't play with them anymore, which is why I like Legacy, much less impact of the banned list. And it really, well, I'll give you a story. The very first Modern deck that I got for somebody was a player who was already very established in Vintage and Legacy. His name was Matt, so I'll use his name if I need to here. But Matt watched the GP or Pro Tour, whatever that first major Modern event was, and Infect was clearly the best deck. I mean, after a couple of rounds of coverage, he was just like, this deck is insane. They're going to be banning this without a doubt. And when they do, I think Cloudpost is actually going to be a decently positioned deck. I think casting Eldrazi off of Cloudpost will be a lot of fun. It was already a Legacy deck, so I already had a bunch of the cards. He bought the whole deck, all foil. I had most of the expensive stuff, ordered a bunch of the little stuff from some of the vendors that I keep store credit with. Before he even got to play in an event, that next Monday morning, they banned the Blazing Shoal out of Infect, just like he expected, and then proceeded to ban Cloud Post on the same announcement, even though it hadn't done anything. They were just like, yeah, it's probably going to be too good once we get rid of this. We want people playing Tron, not Cloud Post. So yeah, that's my perspective on Modern. If you're not getting banned out of it, then you're probably just doing it wrong. And very often when I have put my gaze toward Modern, there's been a clearly best deck. I haven't looked at it with any seriousness in quite a while because we haven't run any Modern events here in store, obviously. But when we were running them, I mean, the last time I paid attention was Phoenix, and I was like, oh, that's obviously the best deck. There was a Hagak deck at one point, and I mean, both times it was just like, man, like if a good player is playing this deck, he's just going to win. And I think pretty much every time that was the case. I mean, you'd have, sometimes it'd be a mirror match. Like I remember specifically with Phoenix, like two of the best players in the room just met in the finals, both of them on the Phoenix deck, and then they just banned Faithless Looting shortly after. Pioneer loses Balustrade Spy, Undercity Informer, Teferi, Euro as well there, and Wilderness Reclamation. I don't really have a whole lot of reason to care about Pioneer. I like the fact that it's given a life to some new cards. Cards like Dig Through Time are worth a little bit of money. I like to see people's collections actually be worth something. I think that's an important thing. It's a sign of the health of the game. It's also great that if people spend money on cards that are actually worth something, the alternative is a absolute disaster. You don't want to lose sight of the fact that this is just cardboard. And if it is not scarce and it does not have value, then you're a fool for buying it. Like that is a total disaster. I mean, it's a great game, but it's not spending thousands of dollars down the toilet great game. It's worth investing thousands of dollars that are going to retain some amount of value, maybe even go up in value. 100% on board there. But I mean, games like Dominion or Ascension, I mean, there's so many great card games. They're not as good as Magic, but you buy a box and you get thousands of cards or hundreds of cards depending on the game. Magic's not like that. We're buying booster packs, and the only way that makes sense is if they're actually worth money. So I think to that end, I'm happy Pioneer exists. I'm happy when we see new formats, especially if they kind of take off. But ultimately, I don't think it's a great way for people to interact with the game. Pioneer, at some point, will end up being just kind of a worse version of Modern, just like Modern is kind of a worse version of Legacy. As the pools get bigger and bigger and bigger, you just kind of look at the cards that you're not allowed to play with, and those cards are generally really sweet. I mean, why would you want to play with shock lands instead of like revised dual lands? Like the price is really the only answer, because it's just more fun to play with duels. So the more fun the format, generally the more expensive it's going to end up being, because there are just more and more sweet cards. But yeah, Pioneer probably couldn't handle Oops decks particularly well. They don't have the same type of history of counter spells and ways of interacting. And Wilderness Reclamation seems like a preemptive ban based off of the changes in the meta, which, similar to banning Cloud Post. I mean, maybe it ends up being right, maybe not. And then Historic, I couldn't actually tell you what's legal and what's not legal in Historic. Like, if somebody came to me and wanted me to like build a deck from scratch, I would have to definitely just copy something that exists. I mean, I couldn't for sure say what's legal and what's not legal. So they're losing Omnath and Euro, which I think surprises absolutely no one. It's kind of a shallow card pool, and those certainly made a big splash in the pool when they arrived and ultimately proved to be too much. So I think my general thoughts, though, about banned restricted lists is I would personally, I think it would be best if they had a clear vision for each format, if they kind of put out a mission statement for what they were trying to do, and then use the banned and restricted list appropriately to try and maintain that vision. I think for a format like Legacy, that vision should be to have the smallest list possible, and that the cards on the list should basically read like a who's who of Magic's greatest mistakes. Like just the most powerful cards. In Legacy, you should be able to play with all but the most powerful cards. In Vintage, I think you should be able to play with everything ever printed in Magic, but the only things restricted should be incredible mistakes based along certain axes. So I would say, you could say undercosted card drawing, fast mana, tutors. Let's start with that. Like, that would be kind of a general place to start. It's like, if it's one of those and it's undercosted, like, we should at least assess it and kind of go from there. But that's a whole complicated thing. Probably one of the only things that you may not have heard somewhere else. I'm sure a lot of this wasn't super controversial, but I would like to see a seasonal approach as well. So I would love it if in Legacy, for example, if when they came out with Commander Legends with Mana Drain in there, if they said, you know what we're going to do? For 3 months, Mana Drain is going to be legal in Legacy. And then we're going to see what happens, and we're going to assess from there. Expect this card to get banned. And maybe you don't do 3 months, maybe you do a month. I don't know. But I think it would be very fun to have more of a season approach when it comes to banned and restricted lists. And I think that's going to be more and more viable as the game goes on, and the impact of new cards may not potentially be as much of a shakeup. So something like Vintage, if you turn around and unban a bunch of cards for a season, that will really shake things up. But as long as you're kind of doing it in a way with some semblance of balance, giving things to different archetypes, I think that could be a lot of fun. I would personally like to see it. I think that would be a better thing to have directed by Wizards than players trying to come up with their own kind of shook up format. And that would be because you can support that online. You can support that with in-store play. And you can have everybody kind of playing the same game. So that's probably the only like really out there thing that hasn't been talked about that I've seen anywhere else, is the idea of doing seasons around bannings where you actually make changes that are expected to go back. And, I would love to see, a card like Gush make its way back into Vintage for some period of time. Well, just had a customer there, so I guess I'll just segue here. Hopefully I wasn't right in the middle of a thought before that break. Into the final thing, which was the errata changing Valki. So I could take or leave this one. Basically, with Cascade, now you cascade until you reveal a card with converted mana costs that qualifies, and then you may cast the spell that has the lower converted mana cost than the Cascade card. So you can Cascade till you hit Valki, and then you can just cast Valki. You can't cast for free the Tybalt on the back, which is fine. I get they're talking about things being more intuitive. I don't really care about that. I don't think intuitive is particularly important in Magic. When they design the cards, sure, make them intuitive, but some of the interactions are going to be complicated. And this one corner case, whatever. I don't want to invoke a slippery slope argument here, but you wouldn't want to go around trying to make a ton of changes just to try and make everything more intuitive when we're talking about really obscure rules interactions in terms of changing the way the cards are printed. In this case, it does kind of work the way people would expect. It's fine. It's Valki will do some videos with him. I don't know that it was actually going to be a super good deck, but he's gone. So I'll do another video at some point about the idea of having strong opinions about the banned restricted list. I actually think the task of a tournament player is to just play the best cards and win. I don't really think it's a great idea to be complaining about stuff ever. Like, if you're complaining about decks, so let's say you don't like Oko. Why don't you like Oko? Are you playing with him and winning? Are you complaining about how you're winning the game? Or are you complaining because you're losing to the card? And I don't hear people that are just absolutely smashing face and putting up amazing results and complaining about the cards. That's just not typically the way that it works. So for me personally, like, I would rather just get good. If I like really, I guess I don't like Blood Moon. I guess I don't like Chalice. I guess I don't like cards that stop me from making plays. I don't even think I'm like entitled to that opinion. I think it just doesn't matter. I think it's irrelevant. Like, I don't think I have much benefit from orienting myself in terms of dictating the cards that my opponents play. So I just don't think it's a great use of energy. I think the Magic communities would probably be better off if we all had a little bit of that in our view, and that it's really not the most productive thing, and also having self-awareness in terms of why we don't like certain interactions and certain cards. If you're in prison, you shouldn't be complaining about being in prison the whole time. Like, that is just like, nobody actually wants to be there. And that's a whole nother video, but the notion that you would just constantly be complaining about cards that are legal or illegal in a format, I just don't think it's the best thing for the community. I think it's best for us to figure out why we're playing and then to go after that. So if you're playing because you want to be very good at Magic and you want to win, then do that. If you're playing because you want to have fun and, play with whatever type of cards, then go ahead and do that. Just don't have a delusional perspective where you are doing one thing and thinking that you're doing the other. That's the danger there, is if you want to play and you want to be king of the kitchen table, that's totally fine and there's nothing wrong with that, but don't have a perspective thinking that you're like a tournament savage when you're complaining about cards being too good and not playing them. Like, the choice for a tournament player to me seems pretty clear. Play the best deck, get the best results, get that prize money, get your name on the leaderboard, get your name in MTG Top 8 or whatever it is now. Morphling.de is long since gone, but get those wins. Put your archetype on the map. If you're playing something rogue, do so well with it that people are equating that deck with you specifically because you're the one that's winning with it. Or, if that's not the case and you're just playing the thing that's the most popular, learn the mirror match better than anyone else and put up incredible results. So that's it. Just a little bit of rambling about the banned reserve list. Like I said, I think the philosophy is the more interesting part to me. I'd rather see Wizards talk about things in terms of their vision for each individual format. So that would be a great move. I would like to see that. But in terms of which cards I want to see come on and off the list, I mean, it's just not really something that I spend the energy on. I hope you found that at least interesting. Let me know if you have any thoughts in the comments. I can respond there. That way, if anyone else has similar thoughts, we'll kind of get that all out in the open and have a little conversation. All right. Thanks for watching.